The storm begins outside, not as a distant rumble, but as a wall. Wind slams across the fjord. Rain needles through the dark. Salt and sleet strike timber walls that have already survived 100 nights like this. Inside the longhouse, people crowd close to the fire. Wool dries, iron warms, children sleep behind carved bedboards, a pot murmurs over the embers. And above them, where most people imagine choking chaos, the smoke does something unexpected. It rises, gathers, lingers high, and then it moves. For many people, Viking life is imagined as a blur of soot and misery, as if their halls were little more than wooden caves with a fire in the middle and no idea what to do with the fumes. But that picture misses something essential. The Norse were not surviving the North by accident. They were engineers of necessity, shipbuilders, carpenters, smiths, and housewrights, who understood wind, heat, timber, turf, moisture, and airflow with a kind of practical precision that never needed equations to be brilliant. Their longhouses were not smoke-free, that is the first truth. But they were also not death traps, and that leads to the real mystery. How did a people living in some of the harshest settled landscapes in Europe keep a fire burning for light, warmth, cooking, and life itself without filling their homes with unbearable smoke? The answer is not one missing chimney. It is not one clever hole in the roof. It is an entire system, a house shaped by climate, a fire chosen for behavior, not spectacle, materials that breathed, openings that pulled, roofs that leaked just enough, and a way of living that turned smoke itself from an enemy into something managed, useful, even protective. To understand that secret, we have to let go of the cartoon version of the Viking hall. People often picture the longhouse as a giant timber box, thick walls, a roaring fire, no chimney, end of story. In that version, everyone inside should be blinded within minutes. Yet, people slept there, cooked there, worked there, held feasts there, and endured winters there. Archaeology supports the picture of central hearths and smoke-darkened interiors, yes. But it also suggests something more subtle. These buildings were designed around smoke, not in ignorance of it. The Viking longhouse was never meant to behave like a modern sealed room. That comparison is the trap. In a modern house, you fight drafts, lock in heat, and send smoke neatly through a flue. In a Viking house, especially in the North Atlantic world and across Scandinavia, builders often worked with looser materials, layered surfaces, and controlled leakage. Warm air rose, smoke pooled high. Tiny openings, porous roofing, doors, ridge gaps, and shifting wind pressure helped pull it away from the living zone. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but effectively enough. That is the impressive reality. The Vikings were not too primitive to invent a chimney. In many cases, a heavy masonry chimney was simply not the best answer for the buildings they had, the fuel they used, and the climate they faced. Their solution was older, rougher, and in some ways more adaptive. It was a ventilation strategy built into the whole body of the house. Now picture the actual problem. A longhouse in winter had to do almost everything. It was shelter, workshop, kitchen, dormitory, storehouse, and social center. It had to hold heat against freezing air, driving rain, and relentless wind. It had to protect food, tools, textiles, animals in some cases, and the people themselves. Fire was not optional. In the far north, darkness lasted for endless hours, damp crept into everything, and cold could turn a weak household into a dead one. But fire in an enclosed building creates a brutal contradiction. The more you close the structure to keep out wind and conserve warmth, the more you trap moisture and smoke. The more you open it, the more heat you lose and the harder it becomes to live through the night. Add wet climate, green timber, sea air, and fuel that does not always burn cleanly, and the problem becomes even harder. A bad house would sting the eyes, blacken the lungs, rot from condensation, and waste precious fuel. In a place where labor and resources were costly, that was not a minor discomfort. It was failure. Ordinary solutions from other worlds did not always fit Viking conditions. Stone chimneys require certain building traditions, certain material priorities, and a different relationship between hearth and roof. The Viking world had stone in some regions, certainly, but timber, turf, wattle, daub, and thatch often shaped domestic building. Longhouses were long, low, and broad. Their fire was often stretched along the center, not tucked into a little corner. Their roofs were immense. Their interiors were communal. Everything about the form demanded another kind of answer. And here is where the genius appears. The reason Viking longhouses did not simply fill with smoke is that they were designed to separate air into layers and to keep the occupied zone below the worst of the fumes. The house did not need to be clear from floor to rafters. It only needed to be livable where people actually sat, slept, cooked, and worked. That sounds simple, it is not. It required builders to shape volume, draft, and heat movement with remarkable instinct. Look at the hall from the inside. The central hearth runs along the axis of the building, usually in the open floor space. On either side are raised platforms or benches where people sit, eat, repair gear, spin wool, and sleep. Already, the house is creating vertical order. The coldest, heaviest air stays lower. The hottest gases rush upward. Smoke thickens near the rafters, where it can linger in a dark layer overhead, while the lower zone remains breathable, enough for daily life. Not comfortable by modern standards, but workable, sometimes surprisingly workable. That leads to the first piece of the engineering: sheer size. A longhouse was not cramped like a hut. Many Viking Age halls had impressive internal volume. That mattered. The higher and larger the roof space, the more room there was for heat and smoke to collect above people's heads. Space itself became a tool. A low, tight cabin would choke quickly. A large hall could create a buffer zone, a smoky upper chamber that functioned like a reservoir. This was not wasted space. It was part of the breathing system. Then there was the roof. People love to imagine a neat smoke hole, as if one square opening solved everything. Some buildings may indeed have had roof vents or adjustable openings near the ridge. Archaeologists debate exactly how universal those were, and the evidence varies. But even without a dramatic chimney-like opening, many roofs were not airtight skins. Thatch, shingles, turf coverings, and ridge constructions could allow smoke to seep through in countless small ways. That slight permeability mattered. A roof that leaked a little air was not a flaw in the Viking world. It was part of how the house exhaled, and the smoke did more than leave. As it drifted through the rafters and roof materials, it dried them. It discouraged some insects and slowed certain forms of rot. It cured and preserved organic materials hanging overhead. Meat and fish could be smoked. Clothing and ropes could dry. Timber above the hearth became dark, seasoned, and tougher in its own way. The upper haze that modern people would call failure was also doing work. The second piece of the system was fuel. Not all fire behaves the same. A bonfire is dramatic, but it is useless indoors. Viking households needed long-burning, controlled heat. Charcoal might be too valuable for daily domestic heating in many settings, saved for smithing or special uses. So ordinary hearth fires often relied on wood chosen and managed with care. Dry fuel mattered. Split wood mattered. Small adjustments in airflow mattered. A household that knew its fire could make it smolder less and burn steadier. Fire tending was a skill, not a background chore. This is easy to underestimate. Smoke problems are often fuel problems as much as architecture problems. Wet wood spits, steams, and chokes the room. Resinous wood can flare and foul the air. Peat, brush, driftwood, and local fuels each behave differently. Viking communities lived close to those realities. They knew what burned hot, what burned slow, what made more smoke, what could restart an ember in the morning, what could survive damp storage, and what should never be wasted. The hearth was technology in the hands of the people using it. The third piece was draft. A longhouse was shaped by moving air even when every door seemed shut. When wind pressed against one side of the building and slipped past the roofline, it created pressure differences. Open a door at the wrong moment and smoke might drop and swirl. Open it at the right moment and the house could draw like a lung. End doors, side doors in some buildings, roof gaps, and cracks in cladding all interacted with the weather outside. Householders likely learned this with the same intimacy a sailor learns a sail. The building had moods, the fire had moods, the wind had moods. Living well meant reading all three. Even the length of the building helped. Air could travel along the central aisle. Heat from the fire could develop a convection pattern, pulling fresher air inward and pushing warmer, smoky air upward and outward. Bench partitions, bed boxes, loom frames, storage chests, and internal posts did not merely clutter the room. They shaped its microclimates. Some zones were warmer, some drier, some more exposed to haze. A longhouse was one structure, but many atmospheres. The fourth piece was the walls. In the Viking world, walls were often thick with earth, turf, timber planks, or wattle and daub combinations, depending on region and date. These materials did not behave like modern plasterboard and vapor barriers. They absorbed moisture, they released it, they buffered temperature swings. Turf in particular was extraordinary in cold climates. It insulated well, sheltered against wind, and paired with timber frames to create houses that held warmth without becoming sterile boxes. The goal was not total separation from the outdoors, it was moderated exchange. That is why the smoky interior and the warm interior are really the same story. Smoke rises because of heat. Heat stays because of insulation and mass. Ventilation works because the building is not perfectly sealed. Change one piece too far in either direction and the balance collapses. Too open and the fire wastes itself against the gale. Too sealed and the hall becomes poisonous. Viking builders operated in the narrow band between those extremes. The fifth piece was maintenance, and this may be the most easily overlooked of all. A longhouse was not built once and forgotten. Roofs were repaired, thatch was renewed. Turf shifted and had to be reset. Soot built up, hearthstones cracked. Ash had to be cleared. Vent paths changed with weather and age. A hall survived because people kept tuning it. The engineering was living engineering. Not a single invention, but a relationship between building and household across decades. There was also a subtle geometry to daily life. The benches along the walls were usually raised above the central floor, and that mattered for more than comfort. The lower aisle near the hearth was the working spine of the house, where fuel, pots, feet, ash, and muddy winter traffic passed. The raised side platforms lifted bodies into warmer, drier zones, while keeping them out of the direct path of smoke surges rolling through the center. Sleep, conversation, and handwork happened not just beside the fire, but in carefully favored layers of air. In some regions and periods, people also shared the broader building environment with animals or with spaces closely tied to animal keeping. That brought extra warmth but also extra moisture, smell, and respiratory challenge. A hall that could manage damp air was a hall that protected more than comfort. It protected food stores from mildew, textiles from clammy decay, and people from the chilling effect of wet interiors. Ventilation, then, was never only about smoke leaving. It was about the whole indoor climate staying stable enough to survive. Now step closer to the people inside. In the firelight, a woman turns bread on a flat stone. Someone feeds the embers with wood that has been drying under the eaves for weeks. A child knows not to stand in the center when the smoke dips. A craftsman near the bench works antler or wood where the air is clearer. Wet cloaks steam gently overhead. The old know which weather makes the hall breathe badly. The young learn where to sleep in the coldest months. Nothing here is random. The builder who raised the frame may never have called himself an engineer, but he knew how. High the roof should climb before snow load became dangerous. He knew how much bend a timber could take. He knew where the prevailing winds struck. He knew what happened when a ridge was too tight or too open. He knew the distance a spark might leap into dry thatch. He knew how to place the hearth so that heat reached the benches and not just the rafters. Knowledge like that was not abstract. It was stored in hands, memory, and repetition. And because the longhouse was communal, the solution to smoke was communal too. People adapted their routines to the building's logic. Cooking, mending, storytelling, sleeping, drying, brewing, and storing were arranged around the behavior of heat and air. The hall trained the people as much as the people maintained the hall. That may be the deepest difference between their world and ours. We expect buildings to disappear into convenience. They expected buildings to be lived with, watched, adjusted, and understood. There is another uncomfortable truth here. Viking longhouses were not clean by modern standards, and no honest history should pretend otherwise. Eyes watered, clothes smelled of smoke, roof timbers darkened, lungs paid some price. But not modern is not the same as poorly designed. In many northern societies, smoke was tolerated because it bought something invaluable: warmth, dryness, preserved food, insect control, and survivable winter living in places where elegant comfort was a luxury the climate did not offer. And perhaps that is why the longhouse feels so intelligent even now. It did not chase perfection, it chased balance. The Viking approach to engineering was rarely about defeating nature outright. It was about observing where force already moved and placing human work inside that pattern. Their ships flexed with waves instead of resisting them like rigid boxes. Their halls breathed instead of sealing themselves like vaults. Their tools were shaped by the grain of wood, the quality of bog, iron, the habits of wind, the cost of labor, the length of winter. Again and again, they solved problems by working with materials as they were. That mindset matters here. Smoke, in a modern imagination, is only waste. In a Viking hall, smoke was hazard, yes, but also signal, preservative, dryer, insect deterrent, and part of the thermal life of the building. They did not eliminate it completely because complete elimination was not the point. They controlled it enough to live. And in harsh landscapes, enough to live can be the mark of extraordinary design. So the next time you picture a Viking longhouse, do not see a crude shack with a fire in the middle and people coughing in the dark because they knew no better. See a winter machine, a structure of timber ribs, insulated skin, raised living platforms, managed fire, porous roof, shifting draft, and practiced human hands. See a building that turned storm, cold, damp, and smoke into something just barely ordered, which in that world was the difference between a hall and a tomb. That is the real wonder of it. Not that the Vikings found a magical way to make smoke vanish, but that they built homes where smoke could exist without ruling the room. Homes that used size, shape, materials, fuel, and airflow in concert. Homes that accepted the hard terms of the North and still carved out warmth, light, and community beneath a blackened roof. There is brilliance in polished monuments, certainly, but there is another kind of brilliance in a hall that keeps children alive through the winter, because its builders understood how air moves above a fire. A longhouse was more than shelter. It was stored experience, a record of failed winters, repaired roofs, better hearths, wiser timber choices, and generations who learned that survival is often an art of small corrections. The smoke did not disappear. It was guided, thinned, layered, and put to work. That may be less romantic than a hidden lost invention. It is also far more impressive, because it means the secret was never one object. The secret was a whole culture paying attention. And maybe that is the lost technique that still deserves our awe. Not just how to build with wood and fire, but how to observe a hostile world so closely that even smoke becomes part of your design. If there is another Viking or ancient engineering mystery you want to step inside next, leave it in the comments, and we'll open the door to another lost piece of the old world.